Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really granular look at a huge global commitment, Australia's 2035 emissions reduction target.
That's right.
You sent us a serious stack of sources. We've got official government projections, detailed assessments from the Climate Change Authority, some sharp political analysis, and honestly, the data suggests a huge gap between the country's ambition and, well, its current path.
It really does. Our mission today is to get past the headlines and really unpack the numbers, scrutinize the policy assumptions, and try to understand the political forces that are at play here.
Right.
Because for anyone tracking global climate action, Australia's story is fascinating. You have this really stark tension, super aggressive targets on one hand.
And on the other, this kind of policy inertia.
Exactly. So we're here to figure out the cold, hard facts. Under the current policies, how far off track is the country, especially for that 2035 goal?
And I think we have to start with the main finding, because it just sets the entire tone for this discussion. The government's own projections say that under current policy, hitting the 2035 target it's just not possible. They project a shortfall that is, frankly, massive.
Massive is definitely the right word. The projections show this really substantial deficit. It means they're going to need an immediate and really intense policy ramp up to avoid failure.
Okay, let's unpack that, this enormous shortfall. First, can you just define the goal? What did the Albanese government set for 2035?
Sure. The target is a cut of between 62 and 70% below 2005 emissions levels.
Okay.
It's an ambitious goal. It's meant to align Australia with that international push to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And 2005 is that key historical baseline everyone uses.
So we have a clear range, 62% on the low end, 70% on the high end. But when the official projections crunch the numbers on current policies, the stuff that's already funded and legislated, where does Australia actually land?
The projection lands at only a 48% cut below 2005 levels.
Okay, let's just pause on that number for a second. If the minimum goal is 62%, but the current path gets them to 48, that's a policy gap of 14 percentage points of emissions reduction.
14 points that they need to find in the next, 11 years?
And if they aim for the high end, that's 70%, the gap is a staggering 22 percentage points.
It really shows the scale of the challenge. We're not talking about just making a few small adjustments.
No.
We're talking about the fact that the policies they have now are only set to deliver about 2/3 of the minimum effort needed. This means they have to find and implement totally new things, powerful enough to cut that extra 14 to 22 points.
Which is, how big is that in real terms?
Well, it's an amount that's pretty much equivalent to the entire emissions reduction they achieved over the last decade.
Wow. That really puts it into perspective. So the target is clear, the projections fall way short. What has the government said? I mean, how do you respond to releasing figures that show you missing your own goal by such a huge margin?
Well, the Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen, he did acknowledge it. Oh yeah, in the government's annual climate statement. He was pretty transparent saying that, and I'm quoting here, additional work is necessary.
But they didn't just admit it, right? They gave a reason for why the gap exists, and I guess why it's not a total failure just yet. Is that just strategic spin?
It is a strategic defense, but it's also rooted in how long-term policy gets made. Their argument is sort of twofold.
Okay.
First, they say it's normal for a gap to exist 10 years out because you haven't pulled all your future policy levers yet. And second, they point out that some announced policies, things that haven't been formally introduced yet, were left out of the projections.
What kind of policies?
The big one is the new fuel efficiency standard for vehicles. It's been highly anticipated, but because it hasn't passed Parliament, it's not in the numbers.
So the argument is that the target itself is the thing that forces action. It's meant to drive new initiatives rather than just reflect what's happening now.
That's the idea.
But isn't leaving out a huge policy like the fuel efficiency standard a little misleading? Especially when we know that's critical for bridging the gap in the transport sector, which keeps growing.
That's the tension right there. It's an accounting thing. You only project what is absolutely certain, but it puts enormous pressure on the policies that haven't been introduced yet.
So their whole plan is to implement, strengthen, and build on existing policies.
Right, but given the size of that 2035 deficit, that means the next few years have to be all about passing some very effective and probably politically difficult new laws.
The political risk is huge. Okay, but let's shift from 2035 to something closer, the 2030 target. That goal is a 43% cut below 2005 levels. It's much nearer, and the projection seems, well, A lot more doable.
It is, yeah. The 2030 projections are much tighter. Emissions are projected to be 42% below 2005 levels by the end of the decade.
So a shortfall of only 1 percentage point.
Exactly. That's a lot easier to close than the 2035 gap.
On the surface, that sounds great. Almost a success story. But with these things, there's always a catch, isn't there? What's the huge caveat that the 42% reduction is hanging on?
It all comes down to the electricity sector.
Oh.
Meeting that 2030 target relies almost entirely on achieving one single goal: 82% of all electricity coming from renewable sources by 2030. If that fails, the whole thing collapses.
And the Climate Change Authority, which is a government agency, they've basically said hitting that 82% goal is far from guaranteed.
Far from it. Independent experts have pointed to two massive choke points. First, the bottleneck in building the new transmission lines to connect all these new solar and wind farms to the grid.
Right, the infrastructure.
And second, these persistent global supply chain delays for all the parts you need.
So this brings us to what might be the single most important detail in this whole deep dive.
The pace challenge.
The pace challenge. What is actually required for Australia to hit that 82% goal in, the 6 years they have left?
It's pretty staggering. The pace of renewable energy growth has to more than double over the next 5 years compared to the previous 5.
More than double.
Yep. So think about all the renewable capacity Australia installed since 2018. They now need to install more than twice that amount of capacity between now and 2030.
Wow. That scale of deployment, day in, day out, for years. That's completely unprecedented for the country.
Monumental. And you're fighting infrastructure approvals and supply chains the whole way.
We did see the government respond to this, though, right? They expanded a renewables underwriting program back in July. Was that meant to kind of grease the wheels for investment?
It was. They're using financial tools to lower the risk for investors, trying to capitalize on the falling costs of solar and batteries. They know that deployment speed is the single biggest risk to the 2030 target.
And what's the current number for renewables?
Right now, renewables provide about 42% of the main grid's power, getting from 42 to 82 in 6 years. That's the real work.
Okay, let's pivot from projections to the present. Let's forget the goals for a minute. What is the current state of play? How are Australia's actual emissions looking over the past year?
So the good news is that national emissions have started falling again.
Okay, that's positive.
Yeah, they had been kind of flatlining since that first big dip during the COVID pandemic, so seeing real movement is a good sign.
What are the specific numbers for the latest report? How big was the drop last financial year?
The total reduction was 2.2%. That drop, about 9.9 million tons, was actually the largest annual reduction from decreased fossil fuel use outside of that weird pandemic year.
And where does that 2.2% drop put the country right now?
Annual emissions to June were 437.5 million tons. That means Australia is now 28.5% below 2005 levels.
So 28.5% down. That's real progress towards the 43% target for 2030? But what was the engine behind that reduction? Was it policy or something else?
It was overwhelmingly driven by the energy sector. About half of that total reduction, so 4.95 million tons, was directly because of more solar and wind pushing coal-fired power out of the system.
That makes the link between the 82% renewables goal and the national numbers completely explicit, doesn't it?
Absolutely. When coal gets pushed out, the national numbers drop immediately. Pollution from power generation fell 3.3%, which actually reversed a small rise we saw the year before.
So decarbonizing the grid is the most effective lever they have.
By far, it's doing all the heavy lifting right now.
Were other sectors helping out at all?
Yes, but with smaller numbers. We saw small reductions from underground coal mines, heavy industry, farming, even households using less gas. But again, it's the power sector doing most of the work.
But every data set has a problem child. Which sector went in the wrong direction and actually increased pollution?
Transport.
Of course.
Pollution from transport just kept climbing, mostly because of two things: more diesel-powered vehicles on the road and more people taking domestic flights as travel rebounded.
And that just highlights why that fuel efficiency standard, the one that wasn't included in the projections, is so important for the 2035 gap.
It's crucial. If transport keeps growing, it will just eat away at the gains made in electricity.
And this is where it all gets political. These projections, these massive challenges, they're sparking some pretty intense and polarized debate. So we have to just report on the reactions from the opposition parties impartially here.
Okay, so let's start on the left with the Greens. Their whole critique is focused on the structural policy. Their leader, Larissa Waters, didn't hold back. She called the projections diabolical.
And what was their core reason for why the gap is so big?
She blamed what she called labor's addiction to coal, gas, and forestry. The argument is that the government can't set these ambitious targets and, at the same time, keep approving new fossil fuel projects that just lock in future emissions.
They also suggested the real numbers might be even worse than the report shows.
They did. Waters claim the report didn't fully account for Queensland's decision to keep coal in its energy mix for a decade longer.
And their solution.
It's very direct. End native forest logging immediately and stop approving all new coal and gas projects, period. For them, the target gap is just a massive policy contradiction.
Okay, now let's flip to the coalition, the main opposition. Their reaction was less about the climate targets themselves and more about household bills.
That's the key difference. The coalition spokesperson, Dan Tehan, he focused almost entirely on the cost of living and energy prices. He accused the government of a betrayal over a promise that power bills would fall by $275.
So their angle is basically, if you can't even deliver cheaper power, how can we trust you with this incredibly complex 2035 target?
That's the subtext.
And we should remind you that the coalition recently abandoned its support for the national net zero by 2050 target, which shows a really fundamental split in climate policy now.
The contrast is so stark. The Greens are pushing for a faster, more structural phase-out of fossil fuels. The coalition is prioritizing energy costs and stability over speed. And the government is trying to find a path somewhere in the middle.
That political divide is such crucial context. But there is one final critical detail that's left out of all these domestic reports we've looked at. And it totally changes how you see Australia's global climate impact.
That would be the exclusion of exported emissions.
Right.
All the government reports we've been talking about, they only focus on emissions generated inside Australia's borders. They explicitly do not include the huge amount of emissions that happen overseas when other countries burn Australian coal and gas.
We hear about territorial emissions all the time, but for a major energy exporter like Australia, how big of a deal are those exported emissions?
Oh, they are enormously consequential. Australia is one of the world's biggest exporters of thermal coal and LNG. It creates this counting paradox, you know? The domestic numbers might start to look better, but the global impact enabled by Australian exports is gigantic.
And the sources gave us a pretty shocking statistic on this.
They did. A recent 2024 analysis found that when you factor in the emissions locked into its exports, Australia ranked second in the world for exported emissions.
Second only to who?
Russia.
Wow. So while Australia is working to cut its domestic emissions by 28.5%, its role as a key supplier of fossil fuels to the world makes it a massive enabler of emissions everywhere else.
It completely reframes the discussion. It moves it from just a domestic policy problem to a global ethical and economic debate about resource extraction. The domestic target is vital, but the true climate impact of the Australian economy is tied to the fossil fuels it ships overseas.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you try to piece together the reality of Australia's climate commitments?
I think we've established three core takeaways.
Yeah.
First, that 2035 target is currently fiction. There's a stark gap of 14 to 22 percentage points between ambition and reality.
Okay.
Second, hitting the 2030 target depends entirely on this almost unbelievable acceleration in renewable energy. The pace has to more than double in the next 6 years.
Overcoming huge hurdles.
Exactly. And finally, the political fight over cost versus speed threatens to derail the very policy changes they need.
The government is making real progress cleaning up the power grid, but major politically tough steps in transport and industry are needed, like right now, to have any chance of bridging that 2035 gap.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises a critical question for how you evaluate policy. Given that Australia ranks second globally for its exported emissions, and those emissions are left out of all these domestic projections, how should you really think about the global responsibility of Australia's energy sector when you're judging its domestic climate promises?
That's a good question.
It's the fundamental paradox at the heart of their whole strategy, and it's something for you to consider as you watch how all of this develops.
A vital point to carry forward. Thank you for walking us through this challenging but really necessary deep dive.
My pleasure.
We hope this analysis gave you the clarity and insight you needed to understand the current situation. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.